The ladder rattles under his boots. Neil Armstrong steadies himself, takes a breath, and then makes that first step into lunar dust. 1 billion people are watching. In that instant, it feels like humanity has reached its ultimate goal. The moon is ours. But while Apollo 11's legendary landing in July 1969 basically won the space race for the USA, it actually wasn't the mission that gave us the most. You see, NASA was so preoccupied with the core mission success that it didn't bother much with the scientific part. And only after the landing had been achieved did engineers start to explore the moon properly. So paradoxically, the greatest discoveries, the ones that changed how we see the moon and even our own planet, came later. For decades, the spotlight has stayed fixed on Armstrong's step, while the missions that followed slipped into the shadows of the public consciousness. So the real question is, what did NASA see on the moon after the Apollo 11 flight? November 14th, 1969. Apollo 12. 4 months after Apollo 11, another Saturn V was prepared to rise into the Florida sky. The crowd was smaller this time, but in it stood President Nixon himself. But then the rain began. Lightning cracked through the clouds, striking the rocket once, then again. Warning lights flooded the cockpit. In seconds, the mission teetered on disaster. Inside the capsule, Commander Pete Conrad was moments away from aborting the flight. Then a voice came from Mission Control. Try CCE to AUX. To most people in the room, this was nonsense, but astronaut Alan Bean recognized it instantly. CCE was the rocket's signal conditioning equipment, basically the box that translated raw electrical data from the spacecraft into information the crew could actually read. The lightning had scrambled it, turning their dashboards into gibberish. But flipping the switch to AUX forced the box to draw from backup power, like hitting a reset button. Seconds later, the instruments blinked back to life. Apollo 12 proceeded to launch with an important mission. This mission wasn't about fame or firsts. Its goal was something truly special. Could NASA land not just anywhere, but exactly where they wanted? 3 days later, the lunar module descended with surgical precision. The astronauts touched down only 180 meters from Surveyor 3, a robotic lander that had been sitting on the moon for over 2 years. Conrad and Bean walked across the dust to the old machine, unbolted pieces of it, and brought them back to Earth. Scientists discovered that some materials had survived years of exposure to vacuum, radiation, and temperature extremes. For the first time, we had proof of how hardware, and perhaps microbes, might endure long-term in space. Apollo 12 also carried a heavier scientific load. The astronauts set up the first Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALESP. Among its instruments were seismometers that could listen to the moon's interior. For years, they picked up natural moonquakes and the impacts of spent rocket stages deliberately crashed into the surface. The results were startling. The moon didn't just shake, it rang. Unlike Earth, where seismic waves quickly fade, vibrations on the moon echoed for up to an hour. That told scientists the moon was dry, rigid, and fractured deep below with a crust, mantle, and a small core very different from our planet's. So while the Apollo 12 mission went much quieter for the public, it really was a breakthrough. Without the ability to land on target, future moon science would have been impossible. Sampling specific regions, placing instruments exactly where they were needed, and planning ambitious missions like Apollo 15 through 17, all of it depended on what was started one stormy November day.
But then the real stress test of the Apollo program began, the one no one was ready for. April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off on its way to the Framar Morrill Highlands. The crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, expected another smooth flight. For 2 days, that's exactly what they had. Then, more than 300,000 kilometers from Earth, came the words that froze Mission Control. Houston, we've had a problem. One of the spacecraft's oxygen tanks had exploded. Shrapnel tore through the second tank and crippled the fuel cells that powered the command module. Lights flickered, Power drained away, and oxygen supplies dropped fast. In a single moment, the moon landing was canceled, and survival itself became the only mission. The only lifeboat was the tiny lunar module Aquarius, built for 2 men to spend just a couple of days on the surface, not to keep 3 alive in deep space. The cabin temperature fell close to freezing. Condensation coated the walls, food became inedible, and Frederick Hayes developed chills in a kidney infection. To make matters worse, exhaled carbon dioxide built up dangerously inside the spacecraft. All this and the square filters from the command module didn't fit the round ports of the lunar module. So NASA engineers guided the crew through a desperate improvisation. Duct tape, plastic bags, and cardboard. A fix that pulled poisonous CO2 from the air and saved their lives. Every maneuver had to be recalculated with slide rules and shouted across the radio. Even the return trajectory had to be adjusted by firing the lunar module's engine while the astronauts steered by sight, lining up Earth and the Sun out the window. Mistakes would mean sailing into deep space with no way back. After 6 harrowing days, Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the Pacific. No moon rocks, no experiments. But perhaps the most important contribution of all, proof that spaceflight was never routine and that ingenuity under pressure could turn catastrophe into survival. So Apollo 13 didn't give us samples from the Marl Highlands. Instead, it gave us a blueprint for resilience, redundant systems, crew improvisation, and the calm of mission control under fire. All became part of NASA's culture. It was the mission that failed on paper, yet succeeded in the one measure that mattered most, bringing its crew home alive.
The next flight carried the heavy weight of redemption to prove that lunar exploration could continue. January 31st, 1971, Apollo 14 lifted off, headed once again for the From Morrow Highlands. Commander Alan Shepard, the first American in space a decade earlier, now had a chance to walk on the moon. But even before they got there, disaster struck. When the command module tried to dock with the lunar lander, the 2 spacecraft refused to lock together. Without that seal, Shepard and lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell could never descend to the surface. Controllers on Earth scrambled for hours, trying every possible command. Finally, Shepard switched to manual control and rammed the ships together with just enough force to make the latch click. Against the odds, Apollo 14 was back on track. On February 5th, Shepard and Mitchell stepped onto the highlands that had seemed cursed just a year before. Their goal was geological, to sample the ancient From Morrow Formation, thought to hold clues about the moon's violent early history. Over 2 moonwalks, they hiked across rolling terrain, hauling tools in a handcart loaded with equipment. What they brought back changed the story of lunar geology. The rocks they collected turned out to be impact breccias, shattered fragments welded together by enormous collisions billions of years ago. These samples showed that the lunar highlands were probably shaped not by volcanoes, as once thought, but by catastrophic impacts. That insight reached further than the moon. It meant Earth, too, had endured a violent bombardment in its youth, an idea that made us rethink planetary science. And in one moment of levity, Shepard pulled a makeshift golf club from his suit and sent 2 balls arcing into the gray sky. A reminder that even in the deadliest of environments, astronauts remained human. Luckily, Apollo 14 restored NASA's confidence after the near loss of Apollo 13 and gave the whole program its momentum back. Phew! But the next attempt would redefine the very purpose of lunar exploration. July 26, 1971, Apollo 15 lifted off. It was a longer, heavier, and more ambitious mission. It was the first of the so-called J missions. These were no short occasional visits anymore. This particular time, astronauts would stay on the moon for nearly 3 days. Commanded by David Scott, with James Irwin as lunar module pilot, Apollo 15 landed near the Hadley-Apennine region, a breathtaking sight of mountains and rills carved into the surface.
For the first time, a lunar rover rolled down the ramp, allowing the astronauts to travel kilometers from their lander. What had once been a few hundred meters of exploration now became wide-ranging traverses into craters, up slopes, and across the ancient landscape. But the most celebrated find came not from a rover drive, but from a single piece of rock. Scott and Irwin picked up a pale, crystalline sample that scientists would later call the Genesis rock, dating back 4.1 billion years. It was an orthosite, formed from the moon's primordial crust when a global magma ocean solidified. Holding it was like holding a fragment of the earliest history of the solar system. Apollo 15 also expanded science in subtler ways. Instruments from the ALSP package monitored seismic waves, heat flow, and charged particles streaming from the sun. Together, they transformed the moon from just a distant curiosity into a planetary body studied in depth. Oh, and as a side job, Commander Scott confirmed the famous Galileo's law. He dropped a hammer and a feather side by side, showing that, in a vacuum, without air resistance, both objects hit the ground together. This was the turning point of the whole Apollo program. It wasn't just a Cold War stunt anymore. Apollo 15 revealed the moon as a time capsule of early solar system history. From this point on, humanity was truly doing field science on another world.
The next mission would go even further, not just to understand the moon, but to reveal something crucial about Earth itself. April 16, 1972, Apollo 16 launched toward the Descartes Highlands, a rugged plateau chosen because it might hold some of the oldest lunar crust. Commander John Young and Charles Duke would land there, while Ken Mattingly orbited above. Curiously enough, Mattingly was actually chosen to fly the disastrous Apollo 13 mission, but contracted measles and was replaced at the last moment. That's why Mattingly probably had a mini heart attack when his long-awaited mission nearly collapsed. A malfunction in the lunar module steering system threatened to scrub the landing entirely. If this thing failed, the astronauts might never lift off again. Controllers debated for hours, weighing safety against science. Finally, with no signs of worsening trouble, NASA gave a cautious go. Young and Duke descended, their craft settling onto the Descartes plain. On the surface, they drove their rover across ridges and craters, collecting samples from some of the most ancient terrain ever visited. Back on Earth, analysis of those rocks eventually led to a revelation in planetary science. The Moon and Earth are chemical twins. Apollo 16 samples, like those from earlier missions, showed oxygen isotopes and trace elements nearly identical to Earth's mantle. That uncanny match reinforced a bold new theory taking shape in the 1970s. According to this idea, billions of years ago, a Mars-sized body, later named Theia, slammed into the early Earth. The collision blasted molten debris into orbit, which eventually coalesced into the Moon. The evidence for that frankly bizarre idea was written all over Apollo samples. A moon with Earth's chemical fingerprint, but stripped of volatiles and iron. Exactly what you'd expect from a world born in fire. The astronauts themselves noticed details that made the moon feel alien, yet familiar. Young and Duke reported the strange smell of lunar dust clinging to their suits, sharp and acid like burned gunpowder. Scientists later traced it to highly reactive soil particles, ground fine by endless impacts and left exposed to radiation. Oh, and to this day, the lunar dust is often cited by NASA as the main reason why it's so hard for us to go back to the moon. You see, our best engineers still haven't come up with a deterrent for this dangerous substance that is coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. It breaks down our lungs and equipment. Anakin would understand. So Apollo 16 gave us more than just samples. It showed that the history of the moon cannot be separated from the history of Earth. Sadly, by 1972, the Apollo program was winding down. Budgets were shrinking, public interest had faded.
Apollo 17 would be the last chance to leave a mark. This one would push science to its absolute limit. December 7, 1972, the final Saturn V thundered off the pad at night, being the only Apollo mission that lifted off not during the day. It carried Commander Gene Cernan, pilot Ron Evans, and for the first time in history, a professional scientist, geologist Harrison Schmitt. Their goal was clear: make the most of humanity's last visit to the moon. Apollo 17 targeted the Taurus-Littrow Valley, a site chosen for its dramatic mix of dark volcanic plains and bright mountain slopes. For 3 days, Cernan and Schmitt lived and worked on the surface. They spent a record 75 hours outside, driving more than 30 kilometers in their rover and hauling back the heaviest load of lunar samples ever, 110 kilograms of rock and soil. Each stop was planned like a geological field trip on Earth, with Schmidt's trained eye catching details no astronaut before him could. Then came the discovery that made Apollo 17 legendary. While sampling near a crater, Schmitt spotted something strange: bright orange soil mixed into the gray dust. Under his visor lamp, it glittered like tiny embers. Back on Earth, scientists realized it was volcanic glass beads, formed 3.6 billion years ago by gargantuan eruptions when lava sprayed from the interior of the moon like a fountain of sparks. It was proof that the moon's volcanic history was more complex and more violent than anyone had imagined after finding those earlier impact rocks. The mission also deployed an expanded suite of experiments, from seismic studies to heat flow probes, painting the most detailed picture yet of the moon's structure and history. Every rock bag, every core sample, added another piece to the puzzle of how the moon, and by extension the Earth, had evolved since the dawn of the solar system. On December 14th, as they prepared to climb back into the lunar module, Gene Cernan looked out across the valley. His footprints and Schmidt's would be the last left on the moon for over half a century. Apollo 17 was the end of an era, but also its climax, the most scientifically rich mission of them all, proving the moon to be both a time capsule of impacts and a stage for ancient volcanic fire. To this day, scientists debate the exact timeline of the moon's history, and even the giant impact hypothesis is currently doubted, since all those collected moon rocks sometimes show a confusing picture. But in some parallel universe where Apollo 11 was the only lunar mission, we have nothing to learn and debate. And for those who still doubt the authenticity of that historical landing, I suddenly have a new counterpoint. You see, while working on this very video, it hit me. Apollo 12 through 17 are actually the best proof that none of it could ever have been faked. Why? Think about it. If you wanted to stage one mission to go to the moon, sure, maybe you could keep that secret. But then why risk repeating the act 5 more times? Why distribute hundreds of kilograms of some rocks to geologists across the world if they're not in fact lunar? It was exactly those later missions that delivered an amount of data no hoaxer would dare invent. Each piece of it cross-checked, published, and scrutinized worldwide. So this way, NASA was able not just to see the moon in all its glory, it showed us all in no uncertain terms that the most complex manned spaceflights were indeed very, very real. Apollo 11 may have given us the first step, but it was the whole ladder of Apollo 12 through 17 that made the achievement itself undeniable.